guys, this is Steven.
I'm Will.
And this is the Post-P Chronicles. So, Will, what do we got today?
Man, we got a very, very, very special guest, a special episode. This is the beginning. This is the very first female perspective of Post-P Chronicles.
Nice.
So I want to introduce you to somebody. It's my sis right here. Yeah, it's my sis right here. Vanessa, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's definitely our pleasure. So, as always, tell us your story.
Whew. I always don't know where to start, but I wanted to start with a disclaimer because I feel like sometimes with my story, I'm always speaking through a filter because I feel like I need to be very sensitive of my family. But then talking about post-prison chronicles, one of the things that I had to experience freedom in is the freedom to be able to tell my own story and share my own experience. And I just want to say that because, as someone that grew up in the foster care system, that is always a touchy subject, is that a lot of it has to do with your family.
Definitely. So I just want to add this disclaimer because we are Post-P Chronicles, Post-Prison Chronicles. Mm-hmm. But as me and Steven talk about all the time, everyone's prison isn't four walls and a sink, and as you just said, foster care is a prison in and of itself that is put on kids, beyond their control. Mm-hmm. So, yes. This is her prison.
Some of our guests have mentioned I was in prison long before I was in prison.
Long before.
Mm-hmm.
So, like Will likes to touch on, post-P isn't exactly full-on incarceration. We could be imprisoned in our thoughts, imprisoned in our situations, our actions, and then what leads us to overcome those. So with that being said, tell us about your upbringing.
Yeah, and I will say that I had a lot of family members that went to prison. So my mom went to prison, my father went to prison, my brother went to prison, my uncle went to prison, my grandmother went to prison. So,
already?
Yeah. My grandma actually, and this will kind of lead me into it, because a lot of times we don't really know the context of our story. Like, we all come into, moving stories, and we're not aware of, what happened before, what was going on in society. But my grandma, she's Native American. She was a single mom, 8 children, and was arrested for welfare fraud or some type of white-collar type of fraud, and went to jail and died in prison that night. What? And my father, my uncle, my aunties and uncles, they didn't know what happened to her. So they were showing up at the prison trying to figure out what happened to their mom, and they found out that their mom had passed away in prison, never really found out what happened, and that's what caused my dad's side of the family to go into foster care. And so how we talk about, cycles, it really is such a cycle. So I went into foster care when I was 3 years old, and the reason why I went into foster care was because of incest, but I didn't know that. And once again, that's a really sensitive topic that you don't really hear a lot of people talk about. But I really do want to lift the veil on some of these hidden family issues that people don't really talk about. And I wasn't told that when I went into foster care, so I didn't really realize what was going on in my family. I have some memories of what it was like for me growing up, but I don't remember too much. But I do remember being in the room with investigators and them having dolls and asking me, if someone touched you here, someone touched you there. And I don't remember what I said. I just remember that. But my mom always blamed me for the reason why me and my siblings went into foster care, because she said that didn't happen. And it could very well be the case that didn't happen. I was 3 years old in a room by myself with 2 investigators while they're showing me so, but that is what led me into the foster care system. And just to, the parallel between foster care and prison, what I would say is that they can both operate mindlessly. Right. And so it's a system of processes and procedures. And I've always been very sensitive. So at 3 years old, being removed from my mom, being removed from my siblings, and feeling like it was my fault, I really wanted love and affection. And when you grow up in the system, foster parents are not allowed to really give that to you. Right. They're not allowed to hug you. They're not allowed to have any type of physical contact. So here I am at 3 years old, being separated from my family, being placed into, first it was a holding center, it was Hillcrest Receiving Center or something. And not really knowing why I got taken away from my mom in the first place.
So we've learned a lot about prisons on this episode, right? The unwritten rules, how it is, laws. You just said there's mindless rules in the foster care system. So a foster parent's not allowed to basically love on you and give you affection like a real parent would. So there's like a cold upbringing. What other rules are there to foster parenting? I mean, obviously I'm not familiar. Will's not familiar.
Well, my grandmother was a foster, and I lived in a home for a certain time with foster kids that would come in and out, but I wasn't really aware of. I seen the coldness that she gave to them. But
tell us the rules that leads to this coldness or lack of affection or lack of nurturing culture that a 3-year-old needs. What are things a foster parent can't do?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that a foster parent can't do. They can't really hug you or show a lot of physical affection towards you. I know that I lived in one of my foster homes, and the foster mom had a biological daughter that was like the same age as me. We were in the same grade. And I remember her daughter would always like cuddle up in bed with her. And I would want that so much. Like, I want a mom to cuddle with. And, you know, I couldn't do that. I couldn't even like really sit on her bed. And it wasn't like a rule, but it was unspoken. All of their cleaning products and knives and all those things have to be locked away. You can't spend the night over, you know, anyone's house when you're going up in foster care. And really, it's a lot of like unsaid things. Like, I knew when we would have visits from social workers when they would come to visit the foster home, that's when like everything needed to be cleaned up. And, you know, you always gave the social worker a good report. And I actually experienced more abuse in foster care than I did when I would go back and live with my real mom. I mean, the abuse in foster care was just rampant.
So how long did you spend in foster care?
So I spent 16 years in foster care, and I moved over 16 times. I was never in a place for longer than a year. And there would be times when I would go back and live with my mom. And so I've seen pictures of like my mom over the years. And when I first went in the foster care system as a toddler, my mom, you know, she was beautiful. She was working, all of that. And then by the time I started living back with her, drugs had already kind of taken over her life. But the system still allowed me to go back with her.
What's the purpose of them moving you every year? Is it you're giving a bad report and you don't want to live there? Or is it just we're going to keep you rotating? What determines your outcome in foster care?
Yeah, so I was a good... I feel like everyone's, you know, good, but I behaved well. I'm a people pleaser. I learned how to people please just from my mom because my mom was violent. She was abusive. And so I was always very aware of how to navigate like difficult, challenging personalities. And so I took that into me with the foster care system. So I did everything I needed. You know, I was clean. I got good grades in school. And sometimes you wouldn't know why you switched homes. You would just come home and literally it would be like, you have to go to a new home. I remember there was one time when I did complain to a social worker that I was being abused in that home. And then it was like I got punished for it because you know, they remove you right away. Sometimes it was because the foster parent decided that the task of being a foster parent was too much for them. Sometimes it was just that their biological children didn't want them to have foster children anymore. There's so many different reasons.
So how does that make you feel every time you move? Like a failure, or you screwed up, or what's going on in your child mind?
Yeah, all of that. Overwhelming self-doubt. When I was growing up in foster care, there were a lot of times when, like I know in the holidays, that I would just be in my room by myself all the time because that was a really difficult time. They would have their family come over to the house. Their family always felt very weird, like not knowing whether or not they should give the foster children presents or not. And so I just wanted to make it easy on everyone and just stay in my room.
Disappear.
And so I spent a lot of time by myself. But this was even when I lived, like in the times when I was like 8, when I lived back with my real mom, I spent a lot of time by myself. And I got through that by like reading. And so I would read a lot of books about like evil. Like I would read so many books about like the Holocaust, so many books about slavery, because my mind was trying to process, how does this happen to people? Right. Like I'm in foster homes, and the foster homes that I'm in are with people that are very well known in church and in their communities. They're looked at as like great people, but behind closed doors, they're abusing me.
Right.
And I had all these questions. I didn't understand what was going on with my mom. I didn't understand why I got taken away from home. I didn't understand anything. And so I'm searching for answers. And I just happened to pick up a book one time about the Salem witch trials, which was, young women that got caught up in the system of that time that burnt at the stake. And for me, as painful as that was at like 7 or 8 reading that book, it started answering questions for me. Wow. And so I became fascinated at a very young age with like how people can become evil. So yeah,
do such evil actions.
So I don't know. This may be a difficult question, but because you went through so much at this time,
nothing's off limits. Ask.
The question I say difficult because how can you pinpoint one thing? But what was like the worst thing? What was the most difficult thing at this time?
Yeah, as a girl growing up in adolescent age and then coming into your teenager years and having moved around so often, and your whole life is just focused at first on survival. Like I learned survival from my mom. Like my mom's a hustler. She's from Gary, Indiana. Like I'm grateful for her survival lessons. Yeah. But then when you're in the system, you learn how to survive by just like going with the flow. Like you're not going to get too attached. You're not going to get too attached to, because when you move into a home, mind you, I moved into 16 different homes. You are learning new ways, new rules, new family members. It's not just your foster parents. It's their family. It's new schools. At one school, you're studying fractions. At the next school, they've already moved past that. And so you're constantly having to like adjust to different food in the home. Like there's so many different things. But the most challenging thing I would say was the girl stuff that I would go through and that I would have no one to talk to about. So like when I started my period, no one had told me. Have you seen the movie Carrie?
I seen the movie. I have.
Are you giving us a visual right now?
Yikes! No.
I know. This is important, though.
No, it's definitely important. Serious face. Let's go.
So it wasn't as traumatic, but when you wake up and you see that, and no one's told you, like, what is happening?
What is going on? What just happened?
Man. And now that I work on the other side, that is a common situation. Like, no one is having these developmental conversations with girls about their body, about the importance of, like, what actually a beautiful thing it is to have a period.
Right.
How do you take care of yourself? What does that mean? It became it literally became a curse because you're dealing with it. You're having this pain. Your body's changing. And no one's really explaining to you what's happening.
I mean, for me, like me and Steven, I don't know. We don't have kids, you know. So this right here is definitely a learned lesson for me because I'm like, to be in that position and not have anybody. And I would imagine it's very difficult.
Yeah,
just
and I know,
as a woman.
I know a lot of females that they tell me their story and they had a loving family. It was super awkward and don't tell dad. Oh my gosh, nobody. You know. So how do you navigate that with foster parents? Obviously you're bleeding and there's blood everywhere. Do you reach out to them for help? Like how do you resolve this issue? I mean, obviously for you it's probably more traumatic than it is normal, and it's like I got no one there. How did you resolve that issue?
Yeah, well, it was my school nurse at school, because when I don't know, this might be TMI, but I'm just gonna say it.
Go ahead.
When you first start your period, it's not.
Why are you looking away? Why are you looking away?
Because I don't want to make you guys uncomfortable.
No, okay.
We're already there. We're there. Just go.
It's not red. It's not like your shirt. It starts off as a different color, and so you think it's something else. And so I didn't know. In the night before, my stomach was upset, so I didn't know what it was. Wow. I didn't know that was that. Okay. And so the next day I was at school, and I went to the nurse because I wasn't feeling well, and then the nurse had to. Has anyone told you about, as a woman each month, and I was like, no. And so she told me about my period, and that's how I found out.
How'd you feel knowing that this was going to happen every single month?
That was traumatic for me because I still didn't appreciate it.
I would imagine, like, what?
Every month for how long? Rest of my adult life? You kidding me?
I just now, like, not just now, but
just now, this many years
month.
later, just now
started
got used to
appreciating the beauty of it. It not being so like, oh my God, I'm on my period. But like, it's actually a beautiful thing when you understand like the meaning behind it. But then even just, you know, the hormones and then boys. Now, growing up in foster care, physical abuse just happened, sexual abuse just happened. So literally in every home that I was in, I was sexually abused to the point where I almost thought that was like a normal occurrence. My mind didn't register that this necessarily shouldn't be happening. And even in the books that I would read about like the Holocaust and slavery and all those books, it didn't deal necessarily with like issues of like molestation, which is a different beast. It's not as violent. It could be, you know what I'm saying? So I wasn't familiar with like how to navigate that. And it wasn't until I was like, one of my foster parents, they went to this church and someone came and spoke at the church about their experience of being abused. And I was like, oh, this isn't actually supposed to be happening to me. Like, this is wrong. But yeah, that was like, I had to navigate growing up and having those experiences, but then starting to be interested in boys. And then like, what is
what's okay and what's not okay? When is it okay for me to say no, or is this too much, or, you know, all those different things? Because I know you said molestation, and for me, in my mind, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's like with rape, we know what that is, you know, but molestation comes in subtle forms that sometimes may be overlooked, or you didn't think, oh, okay, maybe this is not as bad, but it is. And that's what you're saying right now. Like, there was things that you overlooked because you didn't know.
And it was so common.
It's so common.
You didn't think it was like, wow, this is something horrible and evil.
Yeah. Yes. And then now, and it bothers me to think back about it, because now that I'm, you know, grown to this level of understanding, you look back and you realize that people are grooming you. Like, it doesn't just start off blatant. You know, it starts off the conversation, and then, you know, like it
stronger hug.
Yeah, it builds. And so I, you know, talk about survival skills that I learned from my mom. I also had to learn these survival skills when it came to like men, and like reading their motives and going into a foster home and kind of like knowing what someone was about, and having to protect myself. And like I said, you get used to playing to the system. You get used to not saying anything. You get used to not saying anything to social workers, or at least that was the way that I learned how to navigate the system. Right. And I was watching your story when you were talking about like how your origin was at the Boys and Girls Club, and it started making me think, because I feel like a part of my like awakening into like, oh, I'm attractive, was the Boys and Girls Club.
That Boys and Girls Club get people in trouble. No, we love the Boys and Girls Club.
Their original intentions always
right.
Bad things.
The Boys and Girls Club.
Yeah. That's why it's called
right. The birds and the bees.
Man. Okay, man. Oh,
but for someone that grew up not feeling wanted,
right,
and I always still have to check that, because I do want to feel like wanted.
Right.
But then starting to get all that attention was like a high for me. Like, I thought I was like a celebrity when I was up at the Boys and Girls Club. But I didn't have anyone to talk to about like all of these different things that I'm experiencing. And, you know, in the different foster homes that I went through, they were always very involved with church. And I had good relationships with the people miraculously, I went to like the same church, even though I
different foster homes.
Went to different foster homes. But the church is, you know, as churches can be, was very big on like, this is what you should be doing and this is what you shouldn't be doing.
Right.
Which is great, but there wasn't a lot of like helping you understand your development. And so when I aged out of foster care, and now I'm on my own, you're 18. When I was in foster care, there wasn't like this meeting that said, you know, you're getting ready to turn 18, you're going to be out there on your own, this is what it's going to look like. Literally, my foster mom was like, you turn 18 in 2 weeks, you need to figure out where you're going to be staying at, because you have to go. And I was like...
That's a big problem in the foster care system.
Huge.
Where as soon as it's the age out system to where as soon and they end up being homeless. A lot of them end up on the streets because as soon as you turn 18, the system is done with them. Was that this case with you? Like the system was done with you. You're 18, you're grown, get out, figure it out.
Yeah, and I aged out at a different time, so now it's more of an awareness where almost people are like scared to turn 18 because they know it's going to happen. Or 21 now. But when I turned 18, there wasn't any conversation whatsoever. Mind you, when you've been living in a system, you've kind of been operating mindlessly. Right. So I had to start thinking.
Right. Because you're just in survival mode.
Right.
So Will and I talked to our last guest. We've talked about this before. Like when you get out of prison, it's $200 and good luck, right? So the foster care doesn't even sound like you get $200. It's just, hey, see you later.
Yep.
How do you navigate that at your age? What age were you? 18? So what are the next steps going forward from, all right, I've been in this foster care, this abusive system where I've been in survival mode my whole life, being a people pleaser, having the shame. What do you do with your life at 18?
Yeah. So when I turned 18 and I was like out on my own, I was telling everyone, like a few people at my church knew that I was going to be homeless. Like I literally did not have a place to stay. And this random lady who lived like down the street from one of my foster homes was like, oh, you can stay with me. And I was like, okay, great. Like, thank you so much. And then I stayed with her and she ended up having like severe mental health challenges to the point where it was like scary to like live with her. And so that was like my first like, you are really on your own now. And I remember that I realized when I moved out on my own that I had never been alone. Like I had never been in a room by myself ever. And so I remember like one night I was like in my room and it was raining and I started like hearing things and like my mind, I started almost having like a mental breakdown because it was so overwhelming for me to be alone. And then so like now it's like my body has been focused on like surviving and moving from home to home, and now it's a new dynamic where I'm experiencing these moments of like being completely alone, and then I'm starting to realize that I have some challenges with my mental health, like hearing things, being scared to be by myself, all these different memories of everything I've experienced is starting to come up. So yeah, I moved out from her house because it was really crazy and was homeless for a little while. Was just trying to figure out, and then getting into relationships with people and depending on them to like save me. But then not knowing how to like be in a relationship or keep a relationship.
There was a lot of trauma that you experienced. And it seems like at a young age, you found a certain way of dealing with it by reading these. I don't know how to describe these.
They taught me about life,
but
right?
They taught you about life, and that was your coping mechanism. And as you got older, it seems you had to develop different coping mechanisms. Because I didn't hear you reading. So what coping mechanisms did you develop at 18 and 19? What helped you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've always been reading, and I'll say that I would always minimize my own struggle because I had read all these books. So I'm like, what I'm going through is not as challenging as what they went through in Salem, or is not as the Holocaust. Right. And so even now still, like, I have to really, like, no, you, yes, they've gone through that, but you yourself have actually gone through a lot of trauma yourself. And
your trauma is valid.
Exactly.
You can't compare your trauma to, just like you can't compare slavery to the Holocaust. You can't do it. They're equally
evil, right?
Evil, right? So yes, theirs is worse, but you're living yours.
Yeah.
So you have to feel that and validate your feelings and your trauma.
Yeah. For me, it was starting to become comfortable with speaking and saying my story. Even just saying that I was in foster care, because a lot of my friends and stuff didn't know. It was something I was so ashamed of. I didn't want anyone to know that I was in foster care. And so starting to say, like, I grew up in foster care, because when I came out of the system, I didn't want anything to do with the system. So I didn't really I was so abused by it that I didn't want anything to do with it. And so I really was just trying to make it on my own. And when I say that my mom taught me survival skills, she taught me how to like navigate people. Like my mom knew how to like talk to different people. And so one of the ladies at the church, she got me a job as a teller at the bank. And they were like, oh, you got to sell. You got to help people open up bank accounts, blah, blah, blah. And once I learned the game, I could get anyone to do anything. like I was the star of the show. But having gone from foster care 18, by the time I was 19, I was the youngest branch manager at Wells Fargo.
19?
19.
That's super
19.
young. Wow.
19.
You don't hear that.
Yeah, I was going on these recognition trips out of the country. Wow. I had never, drank before. And so I remember I was on this one recognition trip and I forgot who they were, but they were big up in Wells Fargo. We're like, oh, yeah, have a drink. Not realizing I haven't drunk before. And I'm just on
knocking them back.
Recognition trip, knocking them out.
Oh, this good.
Got so sick. And, this is, my coming into, adulthood. I'm having to learn, on the fly. I don't know how to navigate these situations. I didn't even know how to go to the gas station and get gas. I didn't know how to put in the card. No one had taught me any of that. Wow. No one had prepared me to be on my own. So all these things I had to, stumble around and learn. Mm-hmm.
I mean, we say post-P Chronicles, and this is different, but the comparison to what you're saying to prison and
sounds kind of familiar, right?
Very familiar, and I think we talked about this. How foster care is in itself, it can resemble prison, and it's forced on you guys. Mm-hmm. We make decisions that send us to prison. Mm-hmm. That's on us. But you didn't do nothing. Kids didn't do anything. Mm-hmm. And you're put in these positions. And then it sounds like there's not that much help afforded you when you're there.
And what I've noticed is a lot of these foster care children from doing prison ministry and juvenile hall ministry, they hate their foster home, so they go back to juvie. Mm-hmm. They're like, I don't even want to go back to that foster home. So they purposely do something because they'd rather be in juvie. They're treated better. They're not abused. They get 3 square meals. They got their own room. Mm-hmm. They're like, hey, it's either this or foster care. Mm-hmm. And, my dad's on drugs. My mom's on drugs, and I can't go back with them. So I'm just going to go back to juvie. So in a way, the parallels are just, it's crazy, right? Because the kids are like, well, like you were comparing slavery to the Holocaust. Do I want juvie or do I want foster care? They both sound awful to me.
They both sound awful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, foster care is a phenomenon in the United States. When you go to a lot of other parts in the world, they don't have foster care. Like if you struggle within your family, and then your family usually lives near each other. So if something happens to your parents, you're either an orphan or your other family takes you in.
To be adopted.
Yeah, this idea of taking children from one family and then moving them into another family, which it sounds really, really great on paper, but it's still kind of like prison where you're having to get used to being around people but not being connected to them. Mm-hmm. There's such this sense of disconnection that is just constantly with you.
Right. So I just want to say, not all foster parents are bad. So that's not what we're saying. Not all foster parents are bad.
Some great people, right? Yeah, and some great friends that have grown up in my elementary school and high school that were in foster homes, and they love their family.
They love their family
because they were also delivered from a very abusive, drug-ridden family to be in a safer place, which was their foster home.
Mm-hmm. But I think more so what you're saying is there's no real oversight. So even though there are some good foster parents, there's so many bad, and there's no oversight, and it's just to push people through the system that situations end up like yours more often than.
Yeah, and I'm glad you bring that up because I don't want to paint the picture that all foster parents are bad. I had a bad experience in foster care, right. But it's also not like this good parents and then bad parents. It's just people, and then there's just a bunch of stuff mixed up with that. And I think the biggest thing is that parenting, now that I have a child of my own, I realize how challenging it is and how you really have to be aware and be invested in being a parent. And then it's still hard. Right. And when you're growing up in foster care, especially when you're moving around so much, it's really just kind of making sure your needs are met, that you're eating, that you have a bed, that you're going to school every day.
Yeah. 3 hots and a cot.
Foster parents that do that and that are still taking you to church and that are considered good foster parents, which they are. I'm not saying anything against that, but for the foster child, it doesn't matter if the foster parents are good or anything. The impact of you growing up from a child to adulthood, having been disconnected from people that whole time, it's not a good thing.
It's like in prison, you're just a number, right?
Just a number.
And it's like, I'm just another number, another kid in the foster system, and they're just making sure I get all the way through with my needs met.
Bare minimum.
And when you're, you know, in just hearing your story in prison, and you know, there's innocent people that go to prison, but you kind of are dealing with what you did often. Right. In foster care, you're dealing with other people and still feeling very shitty about yourself. Like
you're a victim.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So you got through the foster care system. Like you said, you did make a point to say that you were dealing with some mental issues. And how did you address that?
So when I this is one thing I didn't bring up, but it's super important to the story. When I got out of foster care, I was always very self-conscious about my weight. And so, because I'm tall. And so I remember one of my foster parents was like, you know, girl, you don't want to be tall and fat. You know, you got to be aware of that. And it said it funny, but it always stuck with me. Like, dang, I don't want to be tall and fat. And so that was always a fear for me. So when I got out of foster care, once again, now I'm having to develop my own relationship with food. That had never been a choice or like an option for me. And so I developed an eating disorder. That it was the demon of my life for like 15 years out of the system. And eating disorders are your money, your whole mindset, everything is focused around food. I had to go to treatment, like inpatient treatment for like 6 months. And so I have like these severe mental health challenges that are happening, but I'm also really excelling at work. And so I did really well with like having like this double life. And I would say that when I started healing is when I started like bringing it together. Like I could have an eating disorder. I can have challenges. I can have insecurities about myself. And I can also still be an amazing person that has all these other assets. Like it's all one person.
Now, you said you were surviving at work because you had these amazing survival skills.
Right.
So you could excel while living this double life, correct?
Absolutely.
So then what was the point what got you to mold those two together?
Yeah. And I have to be wary of that because I can still do that. Yeah. I can still survive.
Because I know a lot of people, right, their home life's a wreck, but they're excelling at work. So they're like, well, I don't need to fix anything because I'm making a ton of money. I'm a 19-year-old branch manager. No one's doing as well as me. Yeah, I got these challenges on the side, but who cares? Look what I'm doing. So how do you mold those two together?
Honestly, it was when I got pregnant with my son. And I had, people might hear that because at that time I was working in nonprofits. I was already working with foster youth again. Like I was doing that, but then I was also seeing how much of a struggle it was for people to honestly like heal. It seemed like the challenges that a lot of people experience would just put them on this path where they continuously had to interact or even wanted to be a part of the system. And so when I had my son, for me, it was a wake-up call because I did not want him to experience the same things that I experienced. And so I had to start thinking differently. Like my whole pregnancy was like a whole, how I said that I didn't really understand like women and developing and the beauty of being a woman. I got that when I was pregnant. Like, it was still challenging, but like the carrying life and like the responsibility of that and just how I don't feel like my mom ever had the opportunity to heal so that she could be able to be a mom is what helped me to start to turn my life around. And I'm still doing it. Like it's still a constant process. I hate being this age and like still thinking about how growing up in foster care impacted me, but it does. Like I just have had to realize that these things are always going to be a part of me.
Right. Okay. So you got your son. I've met him before. Cute kid.
Yeah, he is.
Yeah, cute kid for sure. So, and then earlier you said you had siblings and things like that. So how, because all of you guys went through foster care. So, I mean, that had to be rough on all of you. How was your relationship with all of them? How's that relationship going?
Yeah, there's so much, like when I say there's so much to the story, like when you ask these questions, I'm like, oh, I didn't say that. So when I was 19 and I started working at the bank, my sisters were still in foster care. And a situation happened with their foster mom where they were going to get split up. And so I ended up taking custody of them. So when I was 19 and I was struggling with this eating disorder and my own mental health challenges, I was also taking care of my two sisters, one who was 10 years old and the other one who was 5.
Wow.
And
that face says it all.
And I became a licensed
right.
foster parent. So I grew up in
19.
foster care. I became a licensed foster parent.
Wow.
I'm taking care of my siblings. And then I'm realizing, like, oh, man, like, foster parents really do have a difficult job.
Could you hug your siblings?
Right. Well, I actually that was kind of sticky, too, because there were times, we were... Especially me and my sister that we're close in age. And so when we get into arguments, it's hard for me to step into foster parent because I'm like, who are you talking to?
Yeah.
Right.
I'll ship you off to another house right now.
Which would be normal if you guys were just sisters.
Right.
But then there's even this system that's in our sister relationship. And that ended up being like a big thing. And so now we've had to... So I took care of my sisters, I think, like 7 or 8 years. Our family is still somewhat disconnected from the foster care system, which is why I say it still impacts me today. Mm-hmm. But I'm starting to be in relationships with my sister where I'm able to just be their sister. Right. Like, I don't have to worry about, I do still worry about, like, their survival, but I'm learning how to, like, just be a sister. Mm-hmm.
So you're learning to be a sister. Now let's talk about, obviously, the catalyst. Do you have a relationship with your mom? Is she still around? Did the drugs get her? What's going on with that?
So when I got pregnant, I said about how my grandma on my father's side, she went to prison, which is what separated their family. My mom's sister was actually murdered by a serial killer. And that's what led her family into what happened with her family. And I just want to say that because there's always context. Like to know all of someone's story is to forgive all. But she came back in my life when I was pregnant, and she had been clean for 4 years and, wanted to be there for me and my son. And, it was amazing at first, and then she ended up relapsing, stole my car, and certain situations kept on happening to the point where I've had to, like, at this point, not have any contact.
You got to protect you and your child
first and foremost.
Mm-hmm.
So,
but it's still that scripture of, like, honor your mother and father. That's something that I've had to, like, because it's the first commandment. Something I've had to, like, struggle with, because it's like, how do you, because I'm leaving a lot out, but, like, how do you do that in this type of situation? And what I've had to realize, and what I guess I really want people to stay with, is that honor is really about, like, acknowledging and taking into consideration the weight of your origin, like your roots. Like, you do have to honor your mother and father. You have to honor the way that you grew up, because if you don't realize how that's influencing you today in the present, you're asleep. You're completely unaware.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that, for those who don't know, going back to context, Vanessa, we have our post-P Chronicles rehabilitation group out of our gym. Vanessa actually leads the group discussions in kind of the rehab therapy side. I heard bank teller, church. How do you get from all these mental health challenges, eating disorder, bank teller? Mm-hmm. And it seems like Will knew you from MCRP, from helping out there.
No, we knew her from the Homework SD group. We have a group. Go ahead.
So rehabilitation
you've been there longer
group.
Than me.
So how'd you get into all the therapy rehabilitation side for formerly or currently incarcerated men?
Yeah, so when I was working at a nonprofit organization that serves youth that are coming out of the foster care system, I read this book called The Deepest Well by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. I strongly recommend it. But in the book, she talks about how childhood trauma, it impacts later health outcomes. So it's focused around ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. So, like, the level of trauma that you've gone through as a child is directly correlated to your health as an adult. And when I read that book, mind you, me having an eating disorder, being a Black woman, I thought that was, like, mind-boggling. Like, how did I develop I didn't have anyone to talk to about that. Like, how did this happen? And so when I read that book, it explained a lot. And me having grown up in foster care, been a foster parent, I worked in social services. I was now working in the nonprofit world. I had never heard of that correlation between childhood trauma and your health, but I was seeing it with it made sense to me. I'm like, why isn't anyone talking about this? And then I started really looking at like the mental health services that are being delivered, and just seeing how ineffective they were, how they weren't able to speak to like us in our situation. They weren't applicable. They were very systematized themselves and weren't helping people heal or see themselves as whole people. And so I started doing a lot of research and really wanting to like create a curriculum that helped people actualize their wholeness. And so that's what I've been doing. I did it at that organization that I was working for. It was a really successful service that they still offer and provide. And now it's something that I'm carrying out. And I've been to Indonesia, been able to work with communities, women that are coming out of sex trafficking, wow. Dominican Republic. So, yeah.
And it's crazy because anyone, from knowing all the stuff you talk about and how highly Will and all the other guys talk about you, I'd be like, man, this lady has to have a master's degree in psychology and counseling. She's good. But you know what? Everything you're doing is just amazing. And, it comes from the heart and the experience. And obviously, what was ACE? Adverse childhood experiences. Mm-hmm. Like, you're, like you said, we're all in prison. And you know just as well as anyone how bad their prisons are from their upbringing. And that's so cool to see you have a heart for them. And you're obviously living your life now to that purpose to help others. Do you want to speak to that? Your purpose now?
Yeah. When I look back at my life and how I said reading those books as a child, now I'm so grateful for that experience. Like I feel like I could, and I do, I look back at my past with such meaning. It's not something I'm like, oh, I went through this, and oh, I went through that, and oh, I went through this. Which is why sometimes even telling my story, I'm like, because I don't want to like entertain people with my story. But when you heal, you literally start to see the meaning of everything that's happened. It was meant for me to read those books. It was meant for me to experience what I've experienced. I would have never created, I would have never done, and am still planning on doing the things that I'm going to do if it weren't for that. And I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful to have such like meaning and purpose every day when I wake up in the morning.
God had a plan. Even through, in Genesis it says what Satan intended for evil, God can use for good.
Yes.
And look at that, right? I mean, evil stuff happened to you in terrible situation, but now you're turning it around and you are using it for good. And you just said you still have future plans. What are the big pictures and big things you're still trying to work on? Yeah,
so right now I'm writing a book. I was like, should I say the title? So the title is going to be The Wisdom of the Mimosa. And it's really focused on how do you bring femininity, divine femininity into the home, into relationships, into the workplace. Because it's very like heavy masculine, which is fine. But it's like this part of like the feminine spirit that I feel like is needed in a lot of our spaces for people to heal. So yeah, that's what I'm working on now.
Awesome.
I was hearing mimosa. I'm thinking, is this a drink?
The mimosa is the flower for International Women's Day, and so it's meant to relieve anxiety, depression, tension, and the tradition is that when you receive a mimosa flower and you receive what you need from it, you pass it on to another woman. Okay. So it's like how do we pass on this matriarchal wisdom to one another? Because I grew up without that, and so it's like, how do we make these conversations a thing? How can a father that may be a single father raising a daughter be able to have conversations with her about her period and what a beautiful, meaningful thing it is?
That's powerful in and of itself. Just because I grew up with my father and my two sisters, and we lost our mom when we was 8 years old, and I know it was difficult for them. And my dad didn't know what to do. And so I learned later on that it was difficult for her. So just hearing that is like, okay, I understand.
Yeah. Yeah. And, the mother, the mother tongue, that language teaches us how to like nourish and how to love ourselves. There's so much that comes from like that relationship. And when you don't have it, it's a huge void. Yeah.
It's cool to see you're breaking like generational, almost like curses of like, your grandma went to jail, your mother had a drug problem, And now it sounds like you're a great mother and you're writing a book about the femininity and the need for it in the home and the conversations you need to have, the mother tongue. Like, that's huge, you know, because sometimes we've seen with prisoners, keep going back to prisoners because that's what we've been interviewing, or post-prisoners, like, you know, they got to choose a time where they're going to break the cycle, break the chain of just the same repetitive motion. You know, like you said, it sounded like everyone and your grandma, no pun intended, went to prison, right? You know, and it sounds like Will, a lot of people, you know, grew up, went to prison, and everyone has that like prison story. And it's so cool to see that just, it stops with you.
Yeah. And that coming out of the mental prison is just as tough as coming out of the physical prison.
Yeah.
If not tougher.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
Not tougher. You know?
So are there any words of wisdom? Let's say, not just the foster kid, not just the person who got out of prison, any words of wisdom you'd like to share maybe from just life experience and how to change or get over trauma or get out of that self-made prison? What's your best advice?
So I have two things that kind of like flow into each other. One is I think that, and I've talked about this in our group, it's so important for us to create regular times of like remembrance and reflecting on where we are, what came before, how we got to where we are, and where we're planning, and it just be like a space of like remembrance that's happening. We don't really have that, and so people forget what it is that they're trying to do in life, and then they look around and it's 10, 15 years later and they're in the same place and they're like, how did I get here? But our body functions on cycles. Our body is meant to mindlessly have us functioning on cycles. So if you're not creating these moments, these spaces of remembering your journey, remembering where you're headed, chances are you're on an unconscious cycle that you're just, you know, living.
Like spinning on a hamster wheel.
And then the other thing is to cultivate relationships with people that can help you create understanding. And so like, and I had to, because I really struggled when I came out of foster care with having like these really like passionate love affairs that would end horribly. And it was because, like I said, I had that desire to be like wanted. And so I was like putting that energy out and they would really, really want me, but then they wouldn't know how to let me go. And so I had to start learning how to like step back from like passion and like start just focusing on like understanding people and like just if this person is in my life, how can I understand them? And from doing that, it really helped me to understand myself. And so like having those spaces of remembrance where you're pausing and you're reflecting on your journey, whether it's, you know, quarterly or whatever, but then also having those relationships that aren't relationships where you're like trying to get anything, but they're just spaces for you to understand yourself better. When we meet in our groups, the reason why I love it so much is because hearing other people's stories, watching your podcast helps me understand myself more. So yeah, that'd be my two little wisdom tips.
Definitely. So, and we appreciate it. We touched on so many things today. I mean, foster system, the broken system that we need to revamp, you know, because it is need. We do know that it is needed, but it needs also to be better because we're dealing with children, you know, and there's nothing more important than our kids. So we dealt with that. We dealt with the Carrie situation, you know, you know, and you know, I don't know what you think. Like, I learned a lot.
No, she dealt with that. We're not dealing with
that. We talked about that, you know, mental issues, and you know, if you need help, seek help. You know, so definitely we appreciate it. Anything you want to add to it, Stephen? I
mean, I would just piggyback off what you said, and I know what you believe. Like, you're not weak, and you're not weak or just a loser if you ask for help.
Right.
And if you're going through trauma, if you're going through abuse, if you're going through physical abuse, sexual abuse, like speak up, you know, and we live in a day and age where people will listen now. You know, maybe when you were growing up as a kid, you couldn't speak up. And it wasn't the norm to speak up, right? But
that was the prison, just the idea that you thought that you couldn't, because you actually could, yeah.
But in today's day and age, if there's a foster kid, if there's a prisoner,
speak out.
Yeah, speak up in your life. And if you're going through mental health challenges, if you're depressed, if you don't feel right, like, your body is a dynamic equilibrium, and your body will tell you when things aren't right.
Definitely.
So if you're depressed, if you're sad, if you're chronically tired, if you're just never happy, speak up, because something's going on.
For help.
There is strength in asking for help, and I wish I learned this. I learned this probably later in life. I'm like, I gotta be a big masculine, tough man. I can't have a problem. And even now today, I find this like, I lead all these groups. I lead Bible studies. I'm a leader in church. I'm a business owner. I can't have problems, because everyone looks up to me. Right. But no, I have a really close circle of a lot of mentors, and when I have an issue, I'm calling them right away. Like, hey man, I'm going through this. Can you, what do I do? And I think everybody needs that. Yeah. And if you don't have it, you should seek it. Because that's really the key to life. I mean, life's not supposed to be done in a vacuum. We shouldn't be isolated. We're supposed to be doing this in community. That's why I love our group. Definitely. We got going on. It's so, the men all tell me like, oh man, I love Saturdays when we meet. Yeah. And they love you, Vanessa, because you create a safe space for these big old masculine men. We've all done prison time to, be vulnerable with each other and be transparent with one another. And, they're not doing that in prison, right, Will?
Not at all.
So, I mean, it's a new thing to them. The guard's coming down, but it's so beneficial because we need more of that.
And not only that, like you said, that feminine touch, it's easy to talk amongst men.
Yeah.
But sometimes even amongst men, we need that feminine energy.
I agree.
Especially coming from prison, because we're just around men. So having a woman even in the room to talk to helps you ease back into that part of society.
The dynamic is much better with you.
Definitely. And
like I said, the past, how it contributes to where you are. My past has contributed me to being able to be in these spaces with all men and be able to lead these groups. Yeah.
And a verse I like to use now that, obviously I am a Christian, follower of Christ. My favorite Bible verse is in Romans 8. It says, all things work together for good for those who love Christ. So when I do go through with a Christ in accordance to his will, so whenever I do go through adversity, okay, something's happening out of this. I don't know why this sucks right now, but something good's going to come from this. That's why I love your story. You're now reaching thousands of people through a podcast.
Yes.
Maybe you didn't know why your upbringing was where he is today, 16 years, but look at you now.
Look at me.
In foster care, you weren't like, man, I'm going to be helping tons of people one day.
Right.
You were just like, man, this sucks. Why is this going on? And now you're helping tons of people. Like I said, I thought you had a master's degree in psychology and counseling because you're so good at it. But that's life experience where that comes from.
Yeah.
So.
Definitely. So last final words, you want to see if people can reach out to you, anything like that?
You can find me, Vanessa Davis. I'm very, very reachable on Facebook.
All right. Well, Vanessa Davis, we appreciate you.
Thank you so much.
Definitely. Thank you for being on the show. And my name is Will.
And this is Steven.
And this is the Post P Chronicles.